The morning shift at Colony 7's livestock facility usually started quiet, and Marcus Webb preferred it that way. He checked the feeding schedules on his tablet while sipping coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. The imported cattle from Earth were adapting well to the planet's slightly higher gravity, and the local grazing animals they'd been studying showed no signs of the respiratory infection that had worried him last week. Marcus was 35 but felt older. 3 years on this frontier world had aged him in ways that had nothing to do with time. He'd left Earth to escape memories of a family that no longer existed, killed in a transport accident that he'd survived by pure chance. Out here on Draken Prime, surrounded by animals instead of people, the grief felt more manageable. Animals didn't ask questions or offer sympathy that felt like pity. The comm system crackled to life on his desk. All personnel. This is Central Operations. We're running a scheduled maintenance check on Reactor 3. Expect minor power fluctuations over the next 2 hours. Marcus barely registered the announcement. Reactor checks happened monthly, as routine as anything else in the colony. He gathered his medical kit and headed out to the eastern pasture, where one of the livestock appeared to be limping. The sun was setting, painting the crystal formations in the distance with shades of orange and purple that didn't exist in Earth's sky. He was kneeling beside the injured animal, examining its swollen leg, when the world turned white. The explosion came without warning. A sound so massive it seemed to come from inside his skull. The shockwave hit him like a physical wall, throwing him sideways into the grass. His ears rang with a high-pitched whine that drowned out everything else. The livestock scattered in panic, and Marcus looked up to see something impossible. The colony's central hub, where over 800 people lived and worked, was simply gone. In its place was an expanding ball of fire that climbed into the darkening sky like a second sun. The fusion reactor hadn't just failed, it had taken everything with it. Marcus lay in the grass, unable to move, unable to process what he was seeing. Buildings he'd walked through that morning were now scattered debris. The cafeteria where he'd eaten lunch, the medical center where he'd picked up supplies, the residential towers where families were probably sitting down to dinner. All of it was burning. The blast wave rolled across the landscape, flattening smaller structures and sending chunks of metal and concrete spinning through the air. A piece of something hot landed in the grass 10 meters from Marcus, starting a small fire that spread quickly in the dry vegetation. He forced himself to stand, his legs shaking, and stumbled away from the flames. His communicator was dead. The power grid was obviously gone. Marcus wandered through the twilight in a daze, moving on autopilot toward where the colony had been. The heat from the fire was intense even at a distance, and the smell of burning plastic and worse things made him gag. He found the first body an hour later. A woman he recognized from the maintenance crew, killed by flying debris. Then another. And another. By the time full darkness fell, Marcus had stopped counting. He used his medical scanner, desperately hoping to find life signs. But there was nothing. Just silence and the crackle of flames. For 2 days, Marcus searched. He found 23 survivors scattered across the wilderness. People who'd been far enough from the blast to live through it. They gathered in small groups, traumatized and injured, trying to make sense of what had happened. Marcus moved between them, treating burns and broken bones with his limited supplies, working until exhaustion forced him to stop. On the 3rd day, he went back to what remained of his clinic on the colony's edge. The building was partially collapsed, but the treatment rooms in the back were intact. He was sorting through salvageable equipment when he heard it. A sound. Faint and high-pitched. Like a bird's chirp, but somehow different. Musical almost. Marcus followed the sound to the ruins of the building next door. He'd never paid much attention to that structure. It was a research facility, always locked, with security that seemed excessive for a frontier colony. The explosion had torn it open like a broken egg, revealing laboratories and containment units he hadn't known existed. The chirping came from beneath a collapsed section of wall. Marcus began moving debris, careful not to cause further collapse. His hands were bleeding by the time he uncovered it. An egg. Or what had been an egg. The shell was crystalline, fractured into pieces that still glowed faintly with inner light. And inside, struggling weakly, was something that shouldn't exist. The creature was the size of a cat, with scales that shimmered between blue and silver. Its wings were translucent, torn, and burned from the explosion. It had a long neck, a triangular head with large eyes that watched Marcus with obvious intelligence, and tiny claws that scraped uselessly at the shell fragments pinning it down. Marcus had seen pictures in the xenobiology reports. Everyone on the colony had been briefed about the planet's native sentient species, the Draconi. Dragons, the colonists called them, though that was Earth mythology imposing itself on alien reality. The Draconi were dangerous, territorial, and had made it clear through aggressive displays that humans were not welcome near their nesting grounds. This was a Draconi hatchling, and it was dying. Marcus's hands moved before his brain could catch up with all the implications. He carefully freed the creature from the debris, wincing as it made pained sounds that cut through him. Its breathing was labored, and one wing hung at an wrong angle. Burns covered its body, and a clear fluid that might have been blood leaked from several wounds. He should leave it. Taking this creature would make him a target if adult Draconi came looking. The research facility had clearly been keeping it illegally, probably studying it. Getting involved would only bring trouble. But Marcus was a veterinarian. He'd taken an oath once, years ago, to care for creatures that couldn't speak for themselves. That oath hadn't specified species or consequences. He wrapped the hatchling carefully in his jacket and carried it back to his shelter, already mentally cataloging what supplies he'd need. The creature's eyes followed him the whole way, and Marcus wondered what it saw when it looked at him. A rescuer, or just another human who'd caused it pain. Either way, he was committed now. The hatchling wouldn't eat. Marcus had tried everything he could think of over the first 3 days. Raw meat from the surviving livestock, synthesized proteins, even some of the local vegetation. The creature just turned its head away, growing weaker with each passing hour. Marcus had set up his makeshift clinic in what remained of the livestock facility's storage building. The walls were cracked, but stable, and he'd managed to rig a solar panel to power his basic medical equipment. The hatchling lay on a cushioned exam table, its breathing shallow and rapid. He'd treated the burns as best he could, using a general-purpose healing gel that seemed to work on the creature's silicon-based biology. The torn wing was splinted, though Marcus had no idea if he'd done it correctly. Everything about this creature's physiology was alien to him. Its blood sparkled when exposed to air, crystallizing at the edges of wounds. Its body temperature fluctuated wildly, and its heart had 3 chambers instead of 4. But it was the refusal to eat that worried him most. On the 4th day, Marcus sat beside the exam table, exhausted and frustrated. The hatchling's eyes were closed. Its scales had lost their shimmer, and he knew it didn't have much time left. "Come on," he said quietly. "You survived an explosion. You can survive this." The creature's eyes opened slightly, regarding him with what looked like resignation. Marcus noticed its tongue dart out, touching the metal edge of the exam table. It did this again, more deliberately, and Marcus leaned closer. The hatchling was licking the table, not for moisture, but for something else. Its tongue lingered on a spot where some mineral deposits from the planet's water had dried. Marcus sat up straight. Of course. He'd been trying to feed it organic matter when it needed minerals. He rushed outside to the rock formations near his shelter and began collecting samples. Quartz, feldspar, anything that looked crystalline. Back inside, he used a powered grinder to crush them into a fine powder, then mixed it with water to create a thin paste. The hatchling perked up the moment he brought the mixture close. It opened its mouth eagerly, and Marcus carefully spooned the mineral paste onto its tongue. The creature swallowed, made a sound that might have been contentment, and opened its mouth for more. Relief flooded through Marcus. There we go. Over the next week, the hatchling's recovery was remarkable. Its scales regained their shimmer. The burns began healing properly, and it started moving around the clinic with increasing confidence. Marcus learned to read its needs. When its scales dulled slightly, it needed more iron-rich minerals. When they brightened too much, it needed calcium to balance its system. He started calling her Ember because of the way her scales glowed orange when she was content, especially after eating. She seemed to recognize the name by the 10th day, turning her head when he said it. But recognition wasn't the same as trust. Ember hissed whenever Marcus reached for her too quickly. She snapped at his hands when he tried to change her wing splint. Her small claws, still developing but sharp enough to scratch, kept him at a distance. Marcus didn't push. He'd worked with enough frightened animals to know that trust couldn't be forced. He talked to her constantly, keeping his voice low and calm. He moved slowly and predictably around the clinic. He never approached her sleeping area without announcing himself first. Gradually, the hissing became less frequent. Ember stopped retreating to the corner when he entered the room. On the 12th day, she allowed him to remove the wing splint without fighting, though her body remained tense under his hands. "Good girl," Marcus murmured, examining the healed wing. "You're doing great," Ember chirped. A sound he'd learned meant she was relaxed. She stretched the wing experimentally, and though it was still weak, the bones had set properly. By the end of the second week, something had shifted. Ember began following Marcus around the clinic, her claws clicking on the concrete floor. When he sat down to eat his own meals, she settled nearby, watching him with curious eyes. She made small sounds when he was quiet too long, as if checking that he was still there. Marcus found himself talking to her more than he'd talked to anyone in years. He told her about Earth, about the animals he'd treated there, about the family he'd lost. Ember would tilt her head, listening, and Marcus imagined she understood more than was possible. On the 16th day, everything changed. Marcus was organizing his dwindling medical supplies when he heard footsteps outside. He turned to see a man standing in the doorway, a plasma pistol in his hand. Carl Hayes, one of the colony's security officers and one of the survivors Marcus had treated after the explosion. "Marcus," Carl said, his eyes fixed on Ember. "What have you done?" Ember hissed, positioning herself behind Marcus's legs. He stepped forward, putting himself between the weapon and the hatchling. "Carl, put the gun down." "That thing is a draconi," Carl said, his voice shaking. "Do you have any idea what will happen when the adults find it here? They'll kill all of us. She's a baby. She was dying, and I saved her. You should have let it die." Carl's finger moved closer to the trigger. The research team was studying them for a reason. These creatures are dangerous. These creatures are dangerous. Their adults have already buzzed our camps twice. They're looking for something. And you've got it. Marcus held his ground. She didn't ask to be taken from her family. The explosion wasn't her fault. Killing an infant because you're afraid of what might happen is exactly the kind of thinking that got us into this mess. Step aside, Marcus. No. The two men stared at each other. Ember chirped nervously behind Marcus, and he felt her small body pressing against his leg. She was scared, but staying close to him instead of running. That meant something. Carl's hand wavered. "You're choosing that thing over your own species." "I'm choosing not to murder a child," Marcus said quietly. "There's a difference." After a long moment, Carl lowered the weapon. "You're insane. When the Draconi come, and they will come, you'll have signed all our death warrants." He backed toward the door. "Don't expect any help from the rest of us. You're on your own." Marcus listened to Carl's footsteps fade into the distance. He looked down at Ember, who was watching him with those intelligent eyes. "I hope I didn't just make a huge mistake," he said. Ember chirped and rubbed her head against his hand. For the first time, it felt like affection rather than just tolerance. 3 weeks after the explosion, Marcus had established a routine. He woke at dawn, ground fresh minerals for Ember's breakfast, and checked her wing strength with gentle exercises. The other survivors had set up a camp 5 kilometers away, near one of the few intact water purification stations. Marcus visited every few days to trade his medical skills for food and supplies, but he never mentioned Ember. Carl had kept his word about that. The camp had managed to build a basic distress beacon from salvaged parts. Help was coming, but it would take months. The nearest Earth Alliance station was 14 light-years away, and even at faster-than-light speeds, organizing a rescue mission took time. Marcus didn't think much about rescue anymore. His world had shrunk to the clinic, to Ember, to the daily challenge of keeping them both alive. Ember had grown. She was now the size of a large dog, and her wings had strengthened enough for short gliding attempts inside the clinic. She'd knocked over his equipment twice trying to practice flying, and Marcus had learned to secure everything breakable on high shelves. She had a personality now, distinct and undeniable. She was curious about everything, nosing through his belongings, and making disgruntled sounds when he moved things she'd decided belonged in specific places. She was playful too, pouncing on bits of cloth or chasing the light from his scanner across the floor. But she was also intelligent in ways that surprised him. She'd learned to open the storage containers where he kept her mineral food, and she understood when he was preparing to leave the clinic, positioning herself by the door, with obvious hope that she could come along. Marcus never let her outside. It was too dangerous, for both of them. He noticed the changes in the environment during his 4th week on his own. The local wildlife that usually grazed near the clinic had vanished. The small flying creatures that nested in the rocks were gone. Even the insects that normally swarmed at dusk had disappeared. Something had scared them away. Marcus found the claw marks on the 5th week. 4 deep gouges carved into a tree trunk near the water source, each one as long as his forearm. The marks were fresh, no more than a day old. Whatever made them was massive and looking for something. He started seeing shadows at night, huge shapes passing overhead, blocking out the stars. He never got a clear look, but he knew what they were. The Draconi had come. Marcus increased security around the clinic. He set up motion sensors with salvaged equipment and kept a plasma torch within reach at all times. Not that it would do much good against a creature that size, but it made him feel slightly less helpless. Ember sensed the change in him. She stayed closer, making worried sounds when he paced at night. Sometimes she'd rest her head on his lap while he sat watching the sensors, and Marcus would stroke her scales, taking comfort from her presence as much as she took from his. The Draconi came at dawn on the 32nd day. Marcus was outside, checking the solar panels, when the shadow fell over him. He looked up and forgot how to breathe. The creature descending from the sky was enormous. Its wingspan had to be 15 meters across, its body covered in scales like polished black glass. Its eyes glowed with an inner fire, orange and fierce, and when it landed 10 meters from Marcus, the ground trembled. Marcus couldn't move. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but his legs wouldn't respond. The Draconi folded its wings and regarded him with clear intelligence. This wasn't an animal. This was a person, just in a form completely alien to anything human. The creature's head swung toward the clinic, and Marcus realized it could probably smell Ember inside. Without thinking, he stepped between the Draconi and the building, raising his hands in what he hoped was a peaceful gesture. "Wait," he said, knowing it couldn't understand him. "Please, just wait." The Draconi's eyes focused on him. It made a sound, complex and musical, like multiple instruments playing at once. The sound had rhythm and pattern, clearly language, but Marcus couldn't parse any meaning from it. Inside the clinic, Ember chirped. The sound was high and urgent, and the adult Draconi's whole body shifted. Attention locked on that sound. Marcus heard Ember moving inside, her claws scrabbling on the floor as she came to the door. He wanted to tell her to stay hidden, but it was too late. She pushed through the partially open door and froze when she saw the adult. For a long moment, nobody moved. The adult Draconi stared at Ember, and Ember stared back, her body tense. Then Ember made a sound Marcus had never heard from her before, a complex trill that rose and fell. The adult responded, its voice gentler now, and Marcus realized he was witnessing a conversation he couldn't understand. Slowly, deliberately, Marcus stepped to the side. He gestured toward Ember, then toward the adult, trying to communicate his intentions through movement alone. He pointed at Ember's scars, at her healed wing, trying to show that he'd helped her. The adult Draconi approached, moving with surprising grace for something so large. Ember didn't run. She stood still, as the adult lowered its massive head and touched its snout to her forehead. The adult's clawed hand, each talon as long as Marcus's forearm, ran gently over Ember's body, examining her scars with obvious concern. Marcus watched, his heart pounding. This was it. The moment where the adult would either accept what he'd done or kill him for the presumption of touching one of their young. The adult Draconi turned its head toward Marcus. Their eyes met, and Marcus saw something in that gaze that made his breath catch. Not anger, not threat, something else, entirely. The creature lowered its head until it was level with Marcus's chest. Slowly, it pressed its forehead against him, holding the position for several seconds. The scales were warm, almost hot, and Marcus could feel the creature's breath washing over him. Then the Draconi stepped back. It reached into a pouch Marcus hadn't noticed before, hidden among its scales, and withdrew something small. The creature placed the object in Marcus's hand and closed his fingers around it. It was a crystal, perfectly smooth, about the size of a walnut. It pulsed, with faint light. The Draconi made another complex sound, this one directed at Ember. She chirped back, then looked at Marcus with what he could only describe as sadness. The adult spread its wings, and Ember walked slowly to its side. "Wait," Marcus said, and hated how his voice broke. "Is she going to be okay?" The adult looked at him again, and Marcus felt something in his mind, not quite words but close. A sense of gratitude, a promise of safety. Then the adult carefully scooped Ember against its chest, spread its massive wings, and launched into the air. Ember looked back at Marcus as they rose, chirping one last time before they disappeared into the morning sky. Marcus stood alone in the empty yard, holding the crystal, and felt the loss like a physical ache. He'd known this moment would come. Ember belonged with her own kind, but knowing didn't make it hurt less. He'd saved her life, and somewhere in the process, she'd saved something in him too. Marcus couldn't sleep that night. He lay in his makeshift bed, staring at the crystal the Draconi had left. In the darkness, it glowed softly, pulsing like a heartbeat. He held it up, watching patterns of light move beneath its surface, and wondered what it meant. When he finally drifted off near dawn, he dreamed of flying. Not as a human would imagine it, but from a perspective that felt utterly foreign. He saw the landscape below through eyes that registered heat signatures and electromagnetic fields. He felt the wind currents as living things to be read and ridden. Marcus woke with a gasp, the crystal still clutched in his hand. The dream had felt too real, too detailed to be just his imagination. Over the next few days, strange things began happening. When Marcus held the crystal, he caught fragments of something in his mind. Not quite thoughts, not quite images, more like impressions. He'd look at a rock formation and suddenly know its mineral composition. He'd see a plant and understand instinctively whether it was edible or poisonous, though he'd never studied the local flora. On the third day, While examining the crystal in better light, Marcus realized what it was. A teaching device. It was slowly building a bridge in his mind, creating pathways to understand concepts that had no equivalent in human experience. He started keeping a journal, writing down everything the crystal showed him. The Draconi language came first, arriving in chunks that made no sense until suddenly they did. Their written language wasn't letters, but combinations of tones and colors, meant to be sung as much as spoken. Their numbers worked in base 8 instead of base 10. Their concept of time was circular rather than linear. But the crystal showed him more than just language. It showed him history. Marcus saw through Draconi eyes as human ships first entered this system. He felt their confusion when the survey teams landed and began setting up equipment. The Draconi had tried to communicate, but the humans only saw dangerous animals and responded with weapons. The crystal showed him the nursery grounds, a sacred place where Draconi had raised their young for thousands of generations. The crystal formations there sang in the wind, creating harmonics that helped hatchlings develop properly. It was biology, and culture, and religion, all woven together. Then the humans came and built their colony right on top of it. The Draconi had watched in growing anger as human machines tore up the ground, silencing the singing stones. They'd seen human scientists sneaking into nursery caves at night, stealing eggs for study. The research facility Marcus had found wasn't just illegal by human standards. It was a desecration of everything the Draconi held sacred. Marcus sat alone in his clinic, the weight of this knowledge crushing him. The colony had been built on stolen ground. Every person who died in the explosion had been living on top of a place that wasn't theirs to take. He understood now why the Draconi hadn't attacked after the explosion. They hadn't needed to. From their perspective, the humans had brought destruction on themselves. It was justice, painful and absolute. But they hadn't counted on one human saving a hatchling's life. On the 8th day after Ember left, Marcus heard wingbeats approaching. He stepped outside to see not one but 3 Draconi landing in the clearing. He recognized the first one, the adult who had taken Ember. The second was larger, its scales decorated with patterns of silver and gold that seemed to shift in the light. This one carried itself with obvious authority, its movements deliberate and measured. The third was smaller, younger, and it took Marcus a moment to recognize the familiar orange glow beneath blue scales. Ember had grown. In just over a week, she'd nearly doubled in size. She chirped when she saw Marcus, a sound of pure joy, and he felt his chest tighten. The large Draconi stepped forward, and Marcus heard something in his mind. Not words exactly, but meaning translated through the crystal's influence. Come, see, understand. The Draconi gestured with a wing toward its back. Marcus stared, his mind trying to process what was being asked. They wanted him to fly with them, to come to their city. I need to tell the others, Marcus said, holding up the crystal and hoping they'd understand. The other humans. They'll worry if I disappear. The elder Draconi made a sound that Marcus's growing understanding translated as agreement. It waited while Marcus went inside and wrote a quick message on his datapad. He left it on the table where any human would find it, explaining as simply as he could where he'd gone and why. Then he walked back outside and approached the elder Draconi with his heart hammering. The creature lowered itself, making it easier for Marcus to climb onto its back. The scales were warm under his hands, and he found grips between them where he could hold on. The takeoff was terrifying. One moment they were on the ground. The next they were rising with powerful wing beats that made Marcus's teeth rattle. He gripped tighter, pressing himself flat against the Draconi's neck, and tried not to look down. But eventually, curiosity won over fear. Marcus opened his eyes and saw the world transformed. The planet from above was breathtaking. The forests shimmered with colors he hadn't noticed from ground level. Bioluminescent plants creating patterns that only made sense from the air. The crystal formations he'd thought were random were actually part of vast networks, connecting across hundreds of kilometers. He could see herds of local wildlife moving in rivers of living creatures, predators and prey existing in a balance that humans had disrupted without even understanding what they were doing. They flew for hours. Marcus's hands cramped from holding on. His body ached from the unfamiliar position. But he couldn't look away. Ember flew alongside them, occasionally swooping close to chirp at him, showing off her growing flight skills. Finally, as the sun began to set, Marcus saw their destination. The Draconi city rose from the landscape like a dream. Massive crystal spires, some natural and some clearly shaped by intelligent hands, created towers that caught the dying light and transformed it into rainbows. Structures were built into and around these spires, following their organic shapes rather than imposing geometric patterns on them. Gardens hung in the air, suspended by techniques Marcus couldn't begin to understand. And everywhere, Draconi moved through the air and along the crystal surfaces, their scales reflecting light in thousands of shifting patterns. This wasn't a primitive society. This was a civilization that had learned to work with their world instead of dominating it. The elder Draconi landed on a platform near the top of one of the central spires. Marcus climbed down on shaking legs and looked around in wonder. Other Draconi were gathering, dozens of them, all watching him with curious eyes. Ember landed beside him and bumped his shoulder with her head. Marcus reached out automatically to touch her scales, and she made a contented sound. The elder Draconi made a complex vocalization, and Marcus felt the meaning through the crystal. Welcome, human who showed mercy. Learn our ways. Help us understand yours. Perhaps together we can prevent more death. Marcus looked out over the alien city, at the culture humans had nearly destroyed through ignorance and greed, and felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. He was one person, one veterinarian, who'd made a choice to save a dying creature. But somehow, that choice had opened a door. Now he had to figure out what came next. Claude is AI and can make mistakes. Please double-check responses. Marcus spent 6 weeks living among the Draconi, and every day shattered another assumption he'd carried from Earth. They gave him quarters in a tower that overlooked one of the nursery grounds, where he could watch hatchlings play under the watchful eyes of their guardians. The room was simple but comfortable, with surfaces that adjusted to his body temperature and light that shifted with the time of day. Ember visited him every morning. She was growing fast, already large enough that she had to fold her wings carefully to fit through the doorway. She'd bring him things she thought he'd find interesting, smooth stones or pieces of crystal that sang different notes when tapped. Marcus kept them all on a shelf, treasures from a creature who'd decided he was worth remembering. The Draconi communicated through a combination of sound, color changes in their scales, and something the crystal helped Marcus understand as emotional resonance. Their language was like music, each individual having their own voice signature. The elder who'd brought him here was named something that translated roughly as Keeper of Stories, and she took it upon herself to teach Marcus their history. They were old, far older than humanity. They'd been traveling between stars when humans were still figuring out fire, but they'd never been conquerors. They were philosophers, artists, caretakers of worlds. They viewed themselves as part of nature's pattern, not its masters. When Marcus asked why they hadn't simply destroyed the human colony when it first landed, Keeper of Stories showed him through shared memory. The Draconi Council had debated for months. Some wanted immediate action. Others argued for patience, for trying to communicate. They'd believed that any species capable of reaching the stars must have wisdom to match. They'd been wrong about that. Marcus learned about the eggs that were stolen. 12 in total. Taken over 3 years by researchers who thought they were being careful. The Draconi had known about every single theft. They'd been preparing for war when the reactor exploded. You saw it as tragedy. Keeper of Stories communicated one evening, her scales shifting to colors Marcus now understood meant sorrow. We saw it as the universe restoring balance. But we were wrong too. Balance shouldn't require so much death. Marcus asked the question that had been haunting him since he arrived. Why me? Why did you bring me here? Instead of killing me. Keeper of Stories touched her forehead to his, a gesture of deep respect. The meaning came clear through the crystal. Because you showed us something we'd stopped believing existed, in your kind. Compassion without expectation of reward. You risked yourself for a creature you didn't understand, from a species you feared. That is wisdom we thought your people had lost. On the 43rd day after the explosion, Marcus's communicator crackled to life. He'd kept it charged but hadn't expected it to work so far from the colony site. All survivors. This is Commander Lisa Grant of the Earth Alliance ship Defender. We've entered orbit and are preparing rescue operations. Please respond with your coordinates. Marcus looked at Keeper of Stories, who'd been teaching him about Draconi music. She tilted her head, and he felt her question without words. My people, Marcus said. Within an hour, 3 more ships appeared in orbit. The Earth Alliance wasn't taking chances. They'd sent a full military escort, along with the rescue vessel. Marcus watched through the tower's opening as the ships moved into defensive positions. They think you're dangerous, Marcus said quietly. We are, Keeper of Stories replied, her scales flickering with something like amusement. But we don't wish to prove it. Marcus contacted Commander Grant and explained the situation. Her response was exactly what he expected. Shock, disbelief, and an immediate demand that he return to human custody for debriefing. When he suggested a meeting between her and the Draconi leadership, her silence stretched for a full minute. You're asking me to negotiate with alien creatures that have been stalking our survivors for weeks. I'm asking you to talk to people who have every right to be angry with us. Marcus corrected. We built a colony on their sacred ground. We stole their children. The explosion might have been an accident, but everything leading up to it wasn't. Another long silence. I need authorization for something like this. Then get it. Because if you try a military solution, you'll lose. I've seen what they're capable of. 2 days later, Commander Grant agreed to meet at the ruins of Colony 7. Neutral ground, she called it. Though Marcus knew the Draconi would never consider it neutral. It was the scar humans had left on their world. Marcus stood in the clearing where his clinic had been, watching as a transport shuttle landed. Commander Grant emerged with 6 armed soldiers, all looking nervous. From the other direction, Keeper of Stories approached with 2 other elders. Their scales showing patterns Marcus now recognized as formal diplomatic colors. Commander Grant, Marcus said, stepping between the 2 groups. This is Keeper of Stories and her council members. They've agreed to speak with you. Grant stared at the Draconi, her hand resting on her sidearm. Can they understand me? Through me, yes. The crystal they gave me translates both ways now. What followed was the most important conversation of Marcus's life. Through him, both sides began to understand what had happened. Grant learned about the sacred ground, the stolen eggs, the restraint the Draconi had shown, despite provocation. The Draconi learned that most humans in the colony had no idea about the illegal research, that they'd come seeking a new home without understanding whose home they were taking. We can't just abandon this world, Grant said. Earth Alliance has invested billions. Keeper of Stories' response surprised everyone. We don't ask you to abandon space. We ask you to choose better. There are 17 worlds within your reach that we have surveyed and found unsuitable for our needs. They would support human life well. We will share these charts freely. In exchange for what? A promise. Create rules for your species about how to approach new worlds. Search first for those who already live there. Communicate before you colonize. Learn before you take. Grant looked at Marcus. Is this legitimate? They're actually offering to help us find new colonies? They're offering us a chance to do it right this time, Marcus said. We should take it. The negotiations took another week. In the end, an agreement was reached. The surviving colonists would be evacuated. The research into Draconi biology would be destroyed. Earth Alliance would establish first contact protocols and share them with all human colonies. And the Draconi would provide detailed surveys of nearby worlds suitable for human settlement. Grant offered Marcus a position as humanity's first official liaison to the Draconi. He accepted on one condition: 6 more months to continue learning before taking up the role officially. On the day the rescue ships departed, Marcus stood at the memorial that had been erected for the dead colonists. 847 names carved into stone, a reminder of what happened when exploration became exploitation. Ember landed beside him, now nearly full-grown and magnificent. Through their bond, strengthened by months of connection, she shared a vision. A future where humans and Draconi work together, where her children and human children might grow up understanding each other's worlds. "Think it's possible?" Marcus asked her. She chirped, a sound that meant hope in her language, and bumped her massive head against his shoulder with enough force to make him stumble. Marcus watched the last rescue ship disappear into the sky without him. He'd come to this world running from grief, expecting to find nothing but isolation. Instead, he'd found purpose. One act of mercy in the aftermath of disaster had become a bridge between species, proof that compassion could survive, even in the ruins of tragedy. He climbed onto Ember's back, settling into the familiar position between her wings. She launched into the air with powerful beats, carrying him back toward the Crystal City and the work that awaited him there. Below them, the memorial stone caught the sunlight, names of the dead preserved forever. Above them, the future stretched out uncertain and full of possibility. Marcus had no idea if what they were building would last, if humans and Draconi could really learn to coexist. But he knew one thing for certain: it was worth trying. Ember soared higher, and Marcus held on tight, heading toward a sunrise that belonged to both their peoples now. In the end, that was what healing meant. Not forgetting the wounds, but choosing to build something better from the scars. Claude is AI and can make mistakes. Please double-check responses.